Hi, I'm Mark Lever. I'm just going to introduce this, which you all got handed as you came in. The strapline, well, there's a strapline, the different strapline really, so it's a collection of personal testimonies from an emerging market. The idea really was to explore the kind of challenges and the opportunities in creating immersive technologies and immersive experiences at the moment where the whole landscape is changing at speed. Business models emerge, exist, maybe they exist, audience interaction changes, technology changes. It's a very, very fluid landscape. So we're trying to create a snapshot of this world as it stands at the moment. The book's comprised of a series of case studies. I spoke to a lot of content producers across the space, and then we condensed them down to 9, but all the conversations feed into what you're writing, and in between there are think boxes by the co-investigators and researchers on the piece. You'll also find in the book it's not just the Southwest Creative Technology Network fellows in there. Well, I also spoke to some other people in the landscape because I wanted to keep a very broad view, so people like Marshmallow Laser Feast, Rewind, McLaren Automotive, I also had conversations with to feed into it. Our aim really with this was to explore the value of immersion, and value in the kind of the broadest possible sense, the creative value, the commercial value, the value to you as an artist, the value to you as an audience. We didn't really define it. I wanted to kind of work through it and see why people were in this space, to echo Julia's big question. In writing that created a problem for me, in that I needed to create a framework to understand that. I needed to have some kind of way of hanging on to the various different stories, because everybody's approaching this from a very, very wide angle. So the conversations went from functional utility tool on one hand to design disorientation experience on the other. So how do we make sense of why people are in this space? So this is my framework for thinking about why the people I spoke to are in this space. Visual, the capacity for immersive technology to reveal things you couldn't see previously, to describe complexity and to give you a route into that, and the kind of implications of being able to do that. On the commercial, the viability of generating a business model and the challenges in doing that at the moment, and the challenges of balancing the growth of the business, the scale of the business, and continuing to innovate, because the technology keeps changing on you and the audience keeps changing on you. So how do you grow a business in that environment where the fundamentals keep changing? And then impact, and we heard a bit about impact in the last kind of panel. The ability for immersion to create a different relationship with the audience, and what you're trying to do with that, and what you're trying to make them think, and how you're trying to make them interact. And so the case studies are kind of themed in that, even though they're much broader. It gave me a way of thinking about how to approach the idea of immersion, when immersion is a very, very kind of broad term. Within that as well, there were a bunch of cross-cutting principles which came up in all of the conversations that I had across all of the producers. One was about values. As you see, many of these people are moving from a certain practice into something else. The value that they bring with them is they are all comfortable with risk. And they're all comfortable with development with an uncertain endpoint. And the other thing they're very good at is engendering trust in their client or their funder. They're very good at that conversation of, we're going to make this thing. It might not work, and it might not look like the thing that we said that we're going to make, but it's going to be great. And you need to build trust in that, especially if you're working for a commercial client. The kind of creative curiosity that they brought through is a thread that runs through everybody that I spoke to. The other one was about the possible versus the vision. So everybody has a vision of where they want to get to, what they'd really, really, really like to achieve, and then a series of compromises that they made working back from that, because either the technology wouldn't do it or the budget wouldn't do it. But everybody kept the vision. They know where they want to go, and they're all very comfortable that they've got to make compromises knowing where they want to be in the future. And that's just kind of part of the territory. And then the last piece was about technology. No one really was driven by technology for technology's sake. And in fact, the idea of immersive technology are two words that don't necessarily fit together well for all of our producers. Immersion is about experience and impact. The tech is the tool that they use. it's the platform. So the two things are not necessarily codependent. Immersion is designed for, the tech is the thing that you use to make that happen. So hopefully when you read through the case studies, they tell a story about creative innovation across a very, very broad landscape using a lot of different tools. And in some ways, what that highlights is the difficulty in framing this market, in calling it a market. So we've all read the various analysts and consultants with their estimates of value, somewhere between $100 billion and $200 billion, somewhere in the next 2 or 3 years. This massive market appears from nowhere. And yet the position from everybody that I was talking to, who are the producers in this space, looks very different. It looks very challenging, and they feel like they're the pioneers in this space, and they're the ones forming the kind of visual grammar and the languages and the reasons for audiences to engage. And they're the ones hoping that the technology becomes more user-friendly, and so that the scale market emerges. And so it's a very kind of interesting space to be in. Despite all of those challenges, everybody is unbelievably positive. They all believe that this is a step change, and it's a step change to build in some different ethics and some different thinking from the very, very beginning. So I'm going to invite a couple of the people that I spoke to the stage to kind of explore the challenges and opportunities. We'll have a very quick conversation about that, but have a look at the book, and if it raises questions, come back to everybody, because I think we're in a very, very kind of emergent space, and that's what the whole Southwest Creative Technology Network Fellowship is about. So I'm going to invite Jane and Anthony to join me on the stage. It's something to do with the kind of sword arm or something like that. I have to see it that way.
Okay.
You're nearer the sword than I am.
While they try and work out what the hell that was about, can you have 10 seconds to introduce who you are? So they've seen your picture.
My name's Anthony Rowe. I run a immersive experience company called Squid Soup. We've been around for about 20 years doing a range of different approaches to immersive experiences, most recently using walk-through spaces that use light and sound. So it's not worn kit, it's we sort of augment the physical world rather than trying to stick your head in the virtual world.
Thank you.
I'm Jane Gauntlet and I write stories. I've written stories for theatre, audio, interactive audio, virtual reality, 360 film. I'm currently writing a piece called True Love for a headset called Magic Leaps, so mixed reality headset.
So I'm going to echo one of Julia's questions, because I think it's a really interesting question of why have people moved into this space? Why have you kind of evolved what you were doing to embrace immersive technology? And Anthony, you had a great phrase when we spoke about moving away from the one-finger interface. Do you want to explain what that means?
Yeah, it was quite simple. But I started off as an interaction designer about 20 years ago, and I was trying to create experiences where you're just drawn into them using CD-ROMs, screen, mouse, keyboard, and the whole thing just really sucked, because trying to create an immersive experience when you're faced with a screen, there's just a physical boundary. You know, it's very hard to be drawn into it. And then in addition, if you're doing anything that's sort of three-dimensional where you can move around a space, you're looking at the screen, in order to engage anything, you can't stick your hands inside that space. You're ending up using a mouse click or a touch screen or whatever. And so that's the single interface, whereas, you know, it's a very, very narrow bandwidth into a virtual world, an augmented space, whatever it is. Whereas, you know, in our habitual day-to-day experiences, it's very much more broadband. You know, we've got our whole bodies to engage with the world. We've got our other senses as well, and reading body language and, you know, all of that kind of stuff is just hugely more affective and meaningful and engaging and immersive than anything that technology can do at the moment.
And Jane, your journey was much more about personal expression in some ways.
Yeah, so it came from personal experience. In 2007, I had a brain injury and I lost the ability to communicate. So I started exploring other methods of communication. I had a partner who was very argumentative, and before the brain injury I loved arguing with him, but I couldn't keep up with him. So I used to create pre-recorded audio arguments. And I found it worked quite well. So I used to use it to tell them about my ideas, my creative ideas, my desires. You know, it became a really great alternative method of communication. And then from that, I went on to work as a mentor for other people who'd been through trauma. And I was just really surprised by the impact. I get lots of Christmas cards from families about the connections, and I love doing that work. I've written over 120 pieces. And then I discovered video goggles in 2009, and they were really old school, and they weren't 360, and I had to use a stocking to hold them on because they weren't very well designed. And I recreated an epileptic seizure that I had. I wanted to show people I was having up to 11 epileptic seizures a day, and people were frightened of me. They thought I was like the girl from The Exorcist. So I wanted to show them that also it could be surreal, it could be creative, it could be erotic, it could be, kind of terrifying, and all of those things. So I recreated an epileptic seizure that I'd had on a train, and just started working with video goggles from there. I showed that piece to my consultant, and it completely changed our relationship. I went from being this difficult young lady that didn't want to take medication that turned her into a zombie to we just collaborated. So it became a training tool.
And I was interested in how you also brought the experience of interactive theatre to that. So the piece that you're talking about, I don't know if you've ever seen it. Within that, there are some kind of physical touch points beyond the goggles, which help with the immersion.
Absolutely, and within the audio, first started using audio, I really like to blindfold people. I do a lot of work with think tanks and Parliament, and I really quite enjoy there's something about that. But just thinking about the experience in general, so I always think about touch, taste, smell. But I have to be really careful to not do it for the sake of it. I think that's sort of the mistakes I've learned along the way, is kind of don't try to be too clever. But that's really important to me. But I'm really critical of technology, and I squirm every time I hear the word immersive technology.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So Anthony, there's a similar thread in your work, which is about creating a feeling. We want people to feel rather than analyse in particular. That you want it to be open to everybody, but actually you're trying to give them an emotional connection.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, and again, that's very much about technology. And there's a certain type of person that when you create and experience a space that has some kind of digital or technical overlay, there's always a large portion of people that want to know how it works. And that's particularly if you make stuff that's interactive. I think it then becomes a problem to solve. You have to understand the whole technical basis of it in order to engage with it properly. And that is very frustrating. If and Duncan was talking about this earlier as well. If you're trying to create, if you've got something to say, if you're trying to create a specific experience, and all people are worrying about is how it bloody works, that's not really, that's not conducive to an overall benefit that they're going to get to it either, because they're looking at it. It's like, how does this car work, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I've stepped back from agency and interaction quite a lot, just in order to stop that and try and get people to engage with it at an affective level rather than an analytical level. So again, it's also this thing about critical distance, and I think the thing about immersion for me is to try and get rid of that critical distance. You can analyse stuff and do it post hoc after you've done it, but when you're in there, you kind of need to be in there and just like drawn in and intrigued by it and seduced by it, I think, really.
Seduced is a good word to move to Jane. Well, so I'm interested, you're allowing people into the space and allowing them to create the space. With your new work, you have an actor in the space as well, and you're eliciting that human connection. You're trying to draw people in through conversation. Again, the technology is part but not all of it, because it's about human connection.
Yeah, shall I talk a bit about that piece?
Yeah, that would be great.
So I think actually back to seduction, I did make a piece with a couple that had been through, one of them had been through trauma, and they wanted to explore their sexuality, how their bodies and relationship was different, and that was really interesting. That inspired intimacy. So quite a lot of my work is about trying to get people to connect, and it's very, very hard to get people to do it in a headset.
Yeah.
So I'm quite excited about using Magic Leap headsets because you can see through the glasses. So it means that I can see you, but I can project images onto them. And also they have directional speakers, maybe not the right terminology, but it means you can hear the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
And True Love is about true love. It's about how we meet, the risks we take when we fall in love with the person that's the wrong person, when how sex can be really awkward and embarrassing and fabulous and delicious. So it's kind of just exploring that, sort of taking away the manners and the shoulds about
And does the
love.
technology allow you to take away manners or create a dislocation which enables that conversation?
We've done a prototype and that went really well. It's really embryonic. We did a prototype where we took over a restaurant. No, we didn't. We just took a sofa in the corner quite near the toilets. And the idea was that I really wanted to test it out on people that didn't know we were going to be there. You know, I didn't advertise it because I didn't want the kind of the virtual reality, all of these labels, immersive, interactive. It's a small community, and I just really wanted to show it to people that weren't at all interested.
Mm-hmm.
And we did it as an interactive piece with an actor and then a participant. And the idea was that I'd approach them and say, may I take your... Anyway, the idea was that we took their data and then we hooked them up with someone else and gave them access to their data. I could only afford one actor, so we had a very charming 29-year-old who played the date of everybody. The idea was that he was everybody's... we had to kind of hide people around corners so that they didn't know that they were having the date with the same person. It was very cool. But I wanted to get feedback without asking them for feedback as well. So I sat at the bar with a glass of wine, and it was great. People came over. An 80-something-year-old lady said that she hadn't felt that sexy for over 20 years, and she needed to rethink her dating, and maybe she'd try online dating. A young man said that he had never been on a date with a man, and it was so great he might need to rethink his sexuality. So we were like, okay, so if we can get this from spending...
That's audience impact.
Yeah, so I think that made us feel like, let's keep doing it. Because it's quite an expense. You know, it takes a lot of investment and commitment.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to get into that, and then realise that actually audio would be better. The idea of that was to work out whether the headset was a good thing or a bad thing, whether it was just a distraction.
Yeah. Okay. Let's follow that line of trying stuff out, iterating, and then moving forward. Because I think with Squid Soup, I've been really interested in the way that you develop the experiences from submergence to waved, and this iterative idea of make one, try it out, improve it, try it again.
Yeah.
You want to talk through the progression of wave in particular?
Yes, we don't do that many different projects. We've got a few, and they last for quite a few years, and generally, so a project like Submergence, which essentially consists of a whole bunch of individually addressable lights in physical space that is used kind of like an exploded screen, but it's a walk-through space, and you're surrounded by these lights, and we use those to create the illusion of presence and movement and stuff in physical space. So you're mapping a virtual space into the physical world, but it's a physical space. So there's no worn equipment, none of that stuff. So that was the premise, and it took several stages to get to the kind of, to achieving the kind of vision that we were looking for. So, we had problems, for example, with an early version. We had all these strands suspended in the space, but whenever they touched each other, they'd short circuit, and so you couldn't really let people go into the space and surround themselves in these lights, because they get electrocuted, they get caught in clothing and that kind of stuff, which is a different kind of experience to what we were looking for. Yeah. But nevertheless, I think you learn so much by actually just getting it out there into the real world and letting people engage with it and just watching how they respond to it and so on. And so, it's very much an iterative feedback loop. And we've been doing that project for about 12 years now, and it's every time it's different. Every time we put it up, it's different. We tweak stuff, we change stuff. Occasionally, there's a sort of a bigger leap where we sort of completely redo it, but then so it's constantly fine-tuning until it satisfies us, or we get bored of it, or whatever.
And I suppose what I'm interested as well in that is this one of the conversations across all the producers is searching for a business model which allows you to keep innovating.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things with that is each time you've managed to tour it, then go back, rebuild, tour again.
Yeah, exactly, and it sort of, it can be self-funding. I mean, these projects need a bit of a kick to begin with, quite often. But that project has now funded itself. It funds all its iterative developments, and is also funding the next project and the next one to an extent. The thing about it, I mean, so as a piece, we've got a couple of finished pieces that we can just go out and install anywhere now quite easily, and we can charge reasonable money for that. So that money is then used to develop the new pieces. But also, because I think it's really because our approach is about it is a media approach, in that we're looking at digital media in physical space, and these are quite scalable and quite adaptable and so on. That what interests me as well is how they can be used in different ways that we didn't anticipate. So I always saw this piece, Emergence, as an immersive art gallery experience. And then as soon as that got going, someone said, "Oh, can you put it outdoors?" So we think, okay, let's try and see what that is. And then there's all the nightmares about putting it up in Manchester in the snow and the rain. And first time we ever do an outdoor project, which is challenging. But then we did that, and so that's sort of, which was very lucky for us, because that was just as all these winter light festivals started kicking off. So there was a market there that we could then jump into. But then additionally, looking at other applications for it, we've done theatre sets, or at least sort of chat show sets and stage kind of stuff, and music. So we've worked with 3 or 4 bands actually over the years, but one guy in particular, Fortet, we've done a series of gigs with him where we were using this as a volumetric lighting system, initially on stage. So it started off quite traditional. He was at the front of the stage doing his stuff, and the lights were behind him. But then we did a version where it was in the round, so he was in the centre of the bit of the room. The lights were everywhere, and the audience was in the lights. So you start breaking down the boundaries between audience and performer, between art installation and performance, and so on, and as well as the digital and the visual and the physical. So so having got this idea and then pushing it into different spaces is something, and that's something that's sort of being mirrored with the other projects we're doing as well. So Wave, which is about similar but using sound as well as light. So you've got multiple points of sound, which a prototype version is over in the Arnolfini for you all to see this afterwards.
To go. So the importance of audio to that one, I think, is interesting. And Jane, you talked about this a lot with your projects. You start with audio, and that the first place you think about the project is audio, and then build the immersion off the audio.
Yeah, absolutely. It's starting with the story. I think, kind of that's what people remember. They're not going to remember, well, okay, so I'm speaking, my opinion. They're not going to necessarily remember whether the colour grading was right, especially if the story and the audio are really good. It's that kind of choosing priorities, and that's something that comes into a lot in my budgets. And it's led to some quite heavy discussions with VR makers. But yeah, I start with the story and then turn it into an audio experience, and quite often use blindfolds and test that out, because it's much cheaper than making a virtual reality piece. Yeah. I have a collection of really brutal people to give me feedback. And I try it on people in cafes as well and things like that. I quite like to try it on random.
So let's just, we talked a lot in making this about the vision versus the possible, the compromises that are already made. The kind of implications of tech improving, so we're starting to see affordable headsets which don't need wires. Everybody's got an AR device in their pocket now. Magic Leap's come, we've got the kind of next wave of those kind of HoloLens, Magic Leap type headsets. What does the improved technology mean in terms of achieving your vision? Or does it mean nothing? Does it mean I've got a vision and then I still go back and work out what the best tool is?
I think it's just another platform, and that platform might be the right platform for that project, but it might not. But I think something that I've really learned is that I haven't made a VR piece that I'm proud of. I've been proud of how far it's gone and it's touring and things like that, but it hasn't been satisfying as a piece of work. And I think that I accepted that quite early on, that the technology isn't ready to make something that I feel really comfortable with. So I tend to just spend maximum of a week or two on each piece and just let it go and then learn from it, which is really hard. But I think it's just another path.
And so that just continues in different forms?
Yeah, or, Just gives me new toys to play with and to discard, throw out of my pram.
I think that the technology is improving and being able to do more and more things as we progress, but you're always going to hit limitations in the technology if you're trying to do something different anyway, and probably that's where a lot of the creativity comes from, is just dealing with those boundaries, dealing with those restrictions in in an interesting way. I mean, the piece that I was talking about earlier, Submergence, with the idea of all these lights suspended in space, really what I wanted was a light in space with no physical component at all, because then you could just walk through it and do whatever. But that's not possible yet unless you wear headsets and all the rest of it. And I don't really want to do stuff with headsets because I feel that sort of, for the reasons that we've all been talking about.
Yeah.
I think it's...
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, I don't.
So, but then the sort of physical aspects and the technological aspects add sometimes an unexpected dimension that can be good or bad. But certainly, if you play with it in the right way and you're not too wedded to a very rigid idea of what you're trying to do, you can adapt and you can end up somewhere really quite interesting that's not where you expect it to be at all.
Yeah.
I think it's as much the language that will have an impact on things changing. I think in a way, maybe I haven't seen very much, but I feel like the quality is sort of plateauing a bit, I think. But then I think when we stop saying this is immersive, when we stop telling people that it's going to be immersive, or kind of, oh, you're going to love this, which is said to me quite a lot when I put on headsets. People say, oh, you're going to love this, which immediately, kind of makes me despise it. And I think when we stop being too clever, because I think back to agency, I'm with quite a nervous disposition, and if I'm given agency but it's not designed very well, if it's about the ego of the person, God, I'm really gonna have bed on the wrong morning, on the wrong side as well. If it's about the ego of the person making it and not about the audience, it's just sort of it's experimenting, it's taking risks and learning. But I think that has the potential when we stop putting the labels on it, and also when artists start making. I think I see the work by the same people all the time. Every festival I go to, I think it's when a bit more experimental.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, that idea of the move from the novelty, and also if you in the book, Limina talk a bit, and the different perception of having a VR theatre where people pay money and walk through the door. 75% who have never done VR before is actually really interesting. That other kind of audience, because rather than chasing the approval of the film festival.
I think also it's not really critiqued in the same way. I mean, people critique immersive theatre quite a lot now and other platforms, but in terms of headsets, I've read some really great reviews about work, but there isn't very much, and I think it's partly because it's such a small community, kind of we're watching our backs a bit. But yeah, I think when it starts to be critiqued the way theatre is.
Well, the community is now considerably bigger due to all of those fellows.
27.
27 of them, plus 27. We're going to wrap up there. Just before we finish, I want to say thank you very much to Hannah for turning a bunch of scrappy Word documents into a really rather lovely publication. Thank you very much for joining me on stage. Can you thank Jane and Anthony?